A 25-year-old man stands in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by more than 200,000 enemy soldiers, and within the next few hours, he will either become the greatest conqueror the world has ever known, or vanish from history entirely. This isn't fiction. This is 331 BC. The day 47,000 Macedonian soldiers faced the largest army the Persian Empire had ever assembled. And what happened next is still studied in military academies today, more than 2,300 years later. Let's step onto that dust-covered plain, where one young king's decisions changed the course of history forever. To understand why this battle mattered so much, we have to go back a little further. Years earlier, Alexander had inherited the throne of Macedonia after his father's death. A small kingdom in northern Greece, respected for its military, but nowhere near the size or wealth of the empire that lay to the east. That empire was Persia, the largest and richest power the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from the shores of the Aegean Sea all the way to the mountains of India. For generations, Persia had been the measure of what an empire could be, and it was this empire that Alexander decided to challenge. He crossed into Asia with an army a fraction of the size of what Persia could field, and for 3 years, he pushed forward, winning battles, taking coastal cities, cutting off Persia's navy from its ports, and slowly working his way deeper into enemy territory. Along the way, he had already fought Darius once before, at a place called Issus, where the narrow terrain had worked in Alexander's favor, and Darius had been forced to flee the battlefield, leaving behind his own family in the chaos. It was a humiliation Darius never forgot, and one he was determined not to repeat. So when Alexander continued his advance into the Persian heartland, Darius made a decision that would define everything that followed. He chose not to retreat further, not to abandon more territory, but to gather every soldier, every ally, every resource the empire could offer, and meet Alexander in one final, decisive battle. This time, there would be no narrow coastline, no cramped terrain to limit his numbers. This time, Darius chose the ground himself. That ground was Gaugamela, a vast open plain in northern Mesopotamia, near what is today the city of Mosul in Iraq. It was, in almost every way, the perfect battlefield for Persia's style of warfare. No hills to break formation, no forests to hide movement, no narrow passes to bottleneck an army of hundreds of thousands. Just flat, open ground, stretching for miles in every direction. Ground that Darius's engineers had even worked on in advance, clearing and leveling sections of the field so that his scythed chariots could charge at full speed without obstruction. His plan, on paper, was almost impossible to counter. Persia's numbers, some ancient accounts claim over 250,000 soldiers, though modern historians believe the true number, while still massive, was likely lower, would allow him to stretch his lines far beyond Alexander's smaller force on both sides. Once the two armies met, Persian cavalry would sweep around both flanks, encircle the Macedonians completely, and crush them from every direction at once. It's simple, it's logical, and on that open plain, it should have worked. But what Darius didn't fully understand was that Alexander had spent days studying this exact battlefield before the fighting even began. He had sent scouts ahead, walked sections of the terrain himself, and built a plan specifically designed around the one weakness that comes with commanding an army as massive as Persia's: the difficulty of controlling it once the fighting starts. As dawn approached on the day of the battle, the Macedonian soldiers looked out across the plain and saw something that none of them had ever witnessed before: a force stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. War elephants brought from the far reaches of the empire, their massive forms visible even at a distance. Thousands upon thousands of cavalry, and rows of scythed chariots, their wheels fitted with long curved blades designed for one purpose: to tear through infantry formations like a scythe through wheat. The night before, some of Alexander's most experienced officers had urged him to attack under cover of darkness, arguing that a surprise assault might be the only way to overcome such overwhelming numbers. Alexander refused. According to the ancient sources that recorded this moment, he told his officers that he would not steal a victory like a thief in the night, that if he was going to defeat Darius, he would do it openly, in full daylight, in front of both armies. Whether this was pride, confidence, or calculated strategy, historians still debate. But what it meant, practically, was that Alexander needed a plan that could work in full view of an enemy who could see every move he made. When the battle finally began, for the first few critical minutes, it looked as though everything was unfolding exactly as Darius had planned. Horns sounded across the plain. The ground itself seemed to shake as thousands of Persian cavalry surged forward. And leading the charge came the scythed chariots, thundering across the open ground toward the heart of the Macedonian formation, their blades glinting in the morning light. For a moment, it seemed as though nothing could stop them. But Alexander had prepared for exactly this moment. As the chariots closed in, Macedonian light infantry rushed forward, not to block the charge head-on, but to disrupt it, throwing javelins at the horses and drivers, causing panic and confusion in the Persian lines before they even reached Macedonian territory. And then, in the final seconds before impact, something happened that no one on the Persian side had anticipated. The Macedonian formation didn't try to stop the chariots. It opened. Soldiers, trained for exactly this scenario, stepped aside in coordinated, practiced movements, creating narrow corridors within the formation. The chariots, unable to stop or turn at full speed, raced straight through these empty lanes, right past the infantry that should have been in their way. And on the other side, waiting soldiers closed the gap behind them, trapping the chariots and neutralizing them before their crews could recover. Within minutes, Persia's most feared weapon, a tool designed to shatter enemy morale before the real fighting even began, had failed almost completely. It was a small moment in the grand scale of the battle, but it was the first sign that this fight was not going to unfold the way Darius had imagined. And that only the beginning. Because while the chariots were being neutralized, Alexander had already set the next phase of his plan into motion, one that would take the rest of the battle to fully reveal itself. As the fighting spread across the field, observers on the Persian side noticed something strange. The Macedonian line, instead of advancing directly toward the Persian center, was drifting, slowly, steadily, to the right. To Darius and his commanders, this looked like uncertainty, maybe even fear. It looked like an army trying to avoid direct confrontation. So Darius did what any commander in his position would do. He ordered his own cavalry to match the movement, extending his line further and further to prevent Alexander from slipping around his flank. Thousands of Persian horsemen shifted outward in response. And this, more than anything else that happened that day, was the turning point of the entire battle. Because, with every step the Persian army took to match Alexander's movement, its own formation stretched thinner. Commanders further from the center lost sight of what units on the other side of the battlefield were doing. Signals took longer to relay. Coordination, the single advantage that should have come from having such enormous numbers, began to break down, buried under dust, noise, and distance. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left flank, the situation had become desperate. General Parmenion, commanding troops tasked with absorbing the heaviest Persian pressure, was fighting for survival. Persian cavalry pressed hard against his position, threatening to break through and encircle the Macedonian army from behind. Messengers attempted to cross the chaotic battlefield to reach Alexander, to warn him how close to collapse the left flank truly was. And this created the most dangerous moment of the entire battle for Alexander personally. He could see, somewhere in the widening gaps of the Persian formation, that an opportunity was forming, a chance to strike directly at Darius. But he couldn't move yet. If he charged too early, before the gap fully opened, his elite cavalry would be swallowed by the sheer mass of the Persian army surrounding them. And if he waited too long, Parmenian's flank might collapse entirely, unraveling the entire Macedonian position before the opportunity even arrived. For those watching from either side, this must have felt like the longest stretch of the battle. Chaos on every front, dust so thick that soldiers could barely see beyond their own formation, the outcome hanging on a decision that hadn't been made yet. Then, in the middle of all that noise and confusion, it happened. A narrow gap opened in the Persian line, near Darius's own position, the direct result of the very maneuver Alexander had spent the entire battle engineering. It wouldn't last. Persian cavalry, given enough time, would close it again. This was the one moment Alexander had been waiting for since dawn. He didn't hesitate. Gathering his companion cavalry, Macedonia's elite shock force, trained for exactly this kind of decisive strike, Alexander formed them into a tight wedge formation and charged directly through the gap, straight toward the heart of the Persian army. He wasn't trying to defeat 200 soldiers. He was riding for one man, the one man whose presence held the entire empire's authority together, Darius himself. The charge tore through the Persian ranks with a speed and force that caught the defenders completely off guard. Within moments, Alexander's cavalry was closing in on the royal position, and Darius's personal guard rushed forward, desperate to hold the line, because everyone on that battlefield, on both sides, understood exactly what was at stake. If Alexander reached the king, the battle, and possibly the entire war, could be decided in seconds. The fighting near the royal position became intense and compressed, soldiers packed tightly together in the swirling dust, visibility reduced to almost nothing beyond arm's length. And it was in the middle of this chaos that Darius faced the most consequential decision of his reign. He had two choices: stand his ground, risking capture or death in front of his own army, with everything that would mean for how the empire remembered him, or retreat, preserve his life, and hope to rebuild and fight another day. History tells us which choice he made. Darius turned his chariot away from the fighting and fled the field. It's worth pausing on this moment, because what happened next reveals something remarkable about how empires actually function. The decision to flee spread through the Persian ranks faster than any order ever could have. Soldiers who were still fighting, still holding their ground, still willing to risk their lives, saw their king's chariot turning away from the battle. And in that instant, something broke that no sword or spear on that battlefield ever could have broken: their belief that this fight was still worth winning. Formation by formation, the Persian center began to lose cohesion. Officers shouted commands, but those commands no longer carried the same weight. Some units tried to hold their positions. Others began back immediately, and as one unit retreated, it exposed the unit beside it, creating a ripple effect that spread outward through the entire Persian center. Here's what's remarkable, and what historians still point to when studying this battle. The Persian army was not physically destroyed in this moment. Thousands of soldiers were still standing, still armed, still fully capable of continuing the fight. What had broken wasn't numbers or their equipment. It was something far more fragile and far more essential: the confidence that had held this massive, complex system together. Alexander hadn't defeated an army of 200,000 men through superior force. He had identified and struck the single point on which the entire structure depended, and once that point failed, everything connected to it began to fail as well. But the battle wasn't over. Not because while the Persian center was collapsing, Parmenian's forces on the Macedonian left were still trapped, still under brutal pressure, still fighting for their survival. And this presented Alexander with an impossible choice. He could continue his pursuit of Darius, potentially capturing the fleeing king and ending the war in a single decisive stroke. Or he could turn back, abandon the chase, and ride to save his own soldiers who were still fighting for their lives on the other side of the battlefield. He chose men. Alexander turned the companion cavalry around and rode hard back toward the endangered left flank. Their return changed the momentum almost immediately. Macedonian soldiers, seeing their king riding back to support them, found the strength to hold their ground just a little longer. And on the Persian side, as word spread that Darius had already fled the field, the will to keep fighting evaporated. If the king himself had run, why should ordinary soldiers keep risking their lives? One unit withdrew, then another. By sunset, organized Persian resistance across the entire battlefield of Gaugamela had collapsed. The field belonged to Alexander, but Darius had escaped with his life. What followed in the months after the battle changed the ancient world permanently. City after city across the Persian Empire, cities that could have resisted, that had walls and soldiers and resources, chose instead to open their gates without a fight. Suez, Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian royal power. The wealth of an empire that had stood for over 2 centuries, gold, silver, treasures accumulated over generations, passed into Macedonian hands almost overnight, not because Alexander each city by force, but because the authority that had once held the empire together had already broken on the plains of Gaugamela. As for Darius, his story ends not on a battlefield, but in betrayal. Some Persian nobles continued to support him for a time. Others, seeing which way the empire's fortunes had turned, made different calculations. Eventually, the king who had once ruled the largest empire the world had ever known was captured and killed by his own former